The U.S. state of Wyoming has some of the lowest wages in the country. For starters, what many call the dirt low U.S. minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. That hasn't been raised in over a decade. A quarter of the workforce here makes minimum wage or a few dollars more, working essential jobs that are considered the backbone of the economy. But they're paid nothing close to what is considered a livable wage here. MIT's recent cost of living estimate says a single mother with children here should be making $27.53 an hour. That's right, $27.53 an hour. And Wyoming's considered very affordable compared to other states. But none of Wyoming's low-wage workers make anything close to $27.53 an hour.
12 for day shift.
$12 an hour?
Yeah.
$11 an hour here? What do you make?
$10.35.
$10.35 an hour?
Yes. About
$9 an hour? Some workers here, believe it or not, only earn Wyoming's state minimum wage of $5.15 an hour. Some food servers even less.
$2.50 an hour.
You make $2.50 an hour?
Yep.
$2.50 an hour. Relying, she says, mainly on tips. Across the United States, nearly 100 million low-income workers live in near poverty, meaning many only earn $20,000 a year, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. And 30 million more workers live below the poverty line. In Wyoming, 20% of the population lives below the poverty line. Economist Nick Kelsch is one guy in Wyoming who knows how poorly people can be paid here, because he was one of them as a teenager and through college who worked all kinds of minimum wage jobs, clawing his way out of poverty, he says, to become one of the nation's most vocal advocates today for raising the U.S. minimum wage. And he's very passionate about it.
I'm passionate because, I don't know, I think you should care about other people.
Nick's the director of the University of Wyoming Center for Business and Economic Analysis, here in Wyoming's capital, Cheyenne, and says a little-known fact when it comes to the minimum wage issue is that U.S. labor laws exempt many businesses from paying even minimum wage to various employees here, like farm workers, seasonal workers in hotels, child care workers such as babysitters, and many jobs that teenagers are hired for.
For example, if you are a teenager, you're under the age of 20, and you are training in some locations like retail, they can pay you a training wage for the first 90 days of $4.25 an hour, almost half of what the current minimum wage is. If you are mentally or physically disabled, and they determine that you couldn't find gainful employment elsewhere, and that you are a burden based on your output or productivity, they can pay you less than the minimum wage and be justified in doing so.
Kelsch says single mothers with children to support here in Wyoming suffer the most as low-wage workers.
If you're working the minimum wage with children, there's no way you can afford to live off of just one job right now.
Yeah, and I work like 3 jobs, so.
Are you kidding?
No, I'm not.
Nick Kelsch says people in his community should at least be able to make a livable wage. Says he well remembers his minimum wage days a decade ago, when he says it took him forever to save up enough money to buy this truck that he still drives today.
Hope the cracked windshield doesn't ruin your shot.
I love it. Sort of a metaphor, isn't it? Next, he shows us some of the low-income housing he once lived in.
And then these are my old apartments right up here.
Any flashbacks right now?
Aside from my neighbor occasionally stealing my mail, no. I've noticed there are a lot more trailer parks in Cheyenne and really across Wyoming. You'll see them out in rural areas. A lot of them, they get rented out by people who work in like the oil or mining fields, just kind of temp workers. It depends on if it's families or not, so it might be 2 people living in it, it might be 12. Tons of trailer parks because houses are so expensive out here. The average house is $300,000, right? So you can't afford a house out here. You just wouldn't. I mean, minimum wage, if it was $7.25 an hour, you need to find rent for $300 a month.
No mortgage payment that low.
Yeah, there's no way.
A resident here making Wyoming's state minimum wage of $5.15 an hour is living well below the poverty line, making less than $10,000, 10 grand a year.
Could you imagine trying to live off of $5.15 an hour? I mean, we're talking 10 grand a year or less, and then they take out taxes. So really, you're talking about maybe 8 grand a year.
In this trailer south of town lives 72-year-old grandmother Peggy King, who says she struggles to make ends meet each month, even though she's working a union job as a cashier at this fuel station for one of the nation's powerhouse food stores.
I make union wages, and they're above minimum. How much do I make? $15.88 an hour. Still doesn't make it.
And Peggy's also supporting other family members, she says, grandkids and great-grandkids. Peggy says she dreamed of retiring at 65. That was 7 years ago. In the meantime, she reads a lot, memoirs, and loves Stephen King.
We have, I think, just about every book that Stephen King has written.
Really?
Yeah.
Says she just keeps on working because she simply cannot afford to retire.
I'm on Social Security and I have to work a second job because I just can't make it.
What are some of your expenses, for example?
A car, putting gas in the car, groceries. Oh, groceries are horrible. I'm broke at the end of the month.
If you didn't have Social Security?
If I didn't have I'd probably be out on the street.
We observed one Wyoming man asking motorists for money, saying it's difficult to find a decent paying job. Says he usually works in construction.
General labor and, things like construction and, things like that.
Can I see your face?
Yes.
What's your name?
Gentry.
Gentry.
Yeah. But I'm out here right now because I have other mouths to feed. It's hard to find work. I was homeless for quite a while, so my resume doesn't look that good. And my wife's in a wheelchair because she's in a motorcycle accident. And it's hard to have an 8-hour job and still take care of her, because I got to take her to the restroom. I can only be out here for maybe an hour or two at most, then I got to get back to take care of her,
I mean, is it worth getting a minimum wage job, or does it even pay any bills, or what?
It's worth it. Yeah, it's worth it. It's better than nothing, is it not? But is minimum wage enough? Is it enough? That's the question. But that's still my job to figure out.
Figuring out how to raise the minimum wage in the United States to $15 an hour has been the subject of a fierce and emotional debate across the U.S. Some states like California have passed laws to raise their minimum wage to $15 an hour within the next couple years. Other places like New York City have already raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour. However, a majority of U.S. legislators have been reluctant to raise the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour because they say they're worried it will cause large corporate companies as well as smaller businesses to lay off staff and stop hiring employees. Their concerns based on a recent report of the U.S. Congressional Budget Office determining that 1.3 million people would lose their jobs if the minimum wage is increased to $15 an hour. Many owners of small businesses that are considered the heart and soul of many towns across the U.S. are already hurting during the COVID pandemic. Small businesses that can barely pay employees the current minimum wage, that are themselves no longer making a profit. Some owners of these businesses taking on second jobs themselves outside their own small shops to pay their bills. In states like Wyoming, many businesses say it's the cheap labor here that attracted them to the state in the first place. And many say they'll go out of business if they're forced to pay employees $15 an hour. A regional executive of a convenience store chain we spoke with agrees.
Because there's been a lot of talk about the minimum wage and like whether it should be raised or not, and there are businesses that are saying they're against it.
A lot of businesses would be out of business if they had to go to 15 an hour for a minimum wage.
And for decades, many of Wyoming's elected state leaders have been protecting businesses from increasing the minimum wage. However, newly elected Wyoming lawmaker Carly Provenza, who says she grew up in a family that struggled financially, says she's determined to raise the minimum wage in Wyoming for all of Wyoming workers, she says, struggling as she had early on.
I know what those feel like and what it's like to struggle, and those are the people that we need to work for.
Provenza recently proposed legislation that, if passed, would raise the minimum wage in Wyoming to $15 an hour.
It's not acceptable for anybody to have to work 3 jobs, 70 hours a week, and still not be able to pay rent.
As for her colleagues and businesses here claiming raising the minimum wage will lead to a spike in unemployment, economist Nick Kelsch uses graphs to show how when Seattle, San Francisco, and New York City raised their minimum wage to $15 an hour back in 2014, unemployment, if anything, went down.
You don't see any major spike in unemployment at all. In fact, unemployment keeps going down. It keeps continuing with its economic trend. And so after the minimum wage is raised to $15 an hour and phased in, the economy seemed to be doing better.
And if you can give people an opportunity to not work 70 hours a week at 3 different jobs to survive, imagine what they would be doing instead. It ends up paying off. It might be uncomfortable in the short term. That transition into a higher wage for small businesses will hurt, but happier workers are workers that don't turn over. They're workers that work harder, and businesses will see benefits from that. When we talk about job loss, it's okay if you lose jobs if someone who's working 3 jobs now only has to work 1. That's okay that you lost 2 jobs in your state if that person now has a living wage, can spend time with their family, and can thrive. And working at minimum wage now, as it is, doesn't allow for that.
The U.S. government's own research estimates that raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour will lift 900,000 people out of poverty and would save U.S. taxpayers money in funding expensive welfare and food stamp programs currently for the country's poor. And Nick Kelsch says politicians and business leaders evidently forget about other expenses minimum wage workers here have, like health care.
When it comes to health care and the fact that basically Americans are paying at least twice as much, if not more, than any country that has universal health care, and if you're not insured by your employer and you're trying to pay out of pocket, the fact is that the number 1 form of bankruptcy in the U.S. is people going medically bankrupt. There's no way you can afford to live off of just 1 job right now.
How much does this job pay?
They're not allowed to say it.
They're not allowed to say, says that convenience store executive we spoke with earlier, who refuses to tell us how much she pays her employees.
Like, how much do these employees make here?
I can't talk about that, honey.
Is it a livable wage?
I'm living okay.
Well, you probably make more.
Peggy King says she has a message to corporate CEOs in the U.S. who are historically paid hefty multi-million-dollar bonuses every year, when many of their employees are barely surviving.
You know, that bonus could have been spread throughout your employees. Yeah, that's greed. Yeah.
And she says most state legislators in Wyoming simply don't care that the minimum wage here is so low.
They just don't care. You're starving people. You're putting people in poverty. I mean, I'm in poverty.
In the end, it's worth remembering that even workers who have families to support, like Peggy King, who are already earning $15 an hour, are still way short of earning the $27.53 an hour living wage for workers supporting families at home. So even if the U.S. does eventually raise the minimum wage across the country to $15 an hour, which could take years, it will not qualify as a livable wage for millions of people in this country. People like Peggy King.
That's what hurts.